Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits and I'm going to raid the tuck shop, so you stand KV. And there's no musical more KV than Floyd Collins. Ooh, painful link. Well, as we've done it, we might as well carry on. What do you know about Floyd Collins, either the man or the musical? I'm going to tell you that I knew nothing. And until my good friend and fellow Musical Talk presenter Tim Saywood told me that he'd been to see Floyd Collins the Musical by Adam Guettel, who wrote the lyrics and the music, and Tina Landau, who wrote the book and a few additional lyrics, at the Wilton's Music Hall, a wonderful venue in London's East London, and the oldest surviving operating Phase 1 music hall in the world, I'd never heard of the piece. But as you'll hear in just a minute, during the conversation I had with Tim, I learned a lot about the piece, and I'm now very keen at some stage to see it. And it's just my bad luck to have missed the 3 British productions of this show since it was first written and produced in America in 1996. Here in Britain, it was performed professionally at the Bridewell Theatre in 1999, then again at the Southwark Playhouse in 2012, and then only again last year, in August, at the Wilton's Music Hall, as I said, and it was that production which Tim Saywood saw. Well, what's the show about? Well, ostensibly it's about the life or death story of a man, Floyd Collins, after whom the musical is named, who goes potholing and then gets trapped underground. But of course it's also an investigation into the media circus that comes with that, and the irony that fame sometimes arrives in an unexpected way. Here's the way the Southwark Playhouse described it in 2012. Kentucky, 1925. Cave explorer Floyd Collins dreams of finding fame and fortune underground. When a cave-in leaves him trapped 55 feet below the Earth's surface, the media circus above ground makes his personal tragedy a national sensation. Tina Landau and Adam Guettel's award-winning musical is an examination of the media's reaction to the events in the cave, the various attempts to rescue Floyd, and a moving insight into a family's suffering. And here again is some more from the Wilton's website. Based on a true story, the tale of Floyd Collins is told in the style of an open, honest folk opera and illustrated by a hauntingly beautiful score that evokes a heady bourbon blend of bluegrass, Copland and Stravinski with a dash of Gershwin. Plunge into another world and another time with this exceptional musical brought to life within the hallowed walls and atmosphere of Wilton's. And they went one further. They actually hired a bluegrass group called the Sand Cave Crickets to perform in the cocktail bar of the Wilton's venue every night, both before the show and during the interval, to help generate that atmosphere of a small town in Kentucky. Now, the piece itself is an award-winning one and is rightly known for its remarkable, sophisticated score, which in some ways hides its cleverness using the, and I'm going to put speech marks around this, simplicity of traditional folk music in the American idiom. It's also, of course, about a culture clash. The country versus the town, the city versus the rural environments, and I'm putting speech marks around these, simplicity versus sophistication. So, are you ready for the lowdown, the real straight poop? Because here comes the motherlode scoop. And I hope you're ready for the info, because she's a pip. You'll be mighty glad you made the trip. I am, of course, misquoting the lyrics from the Journalist songs called Is It Remarkable? And we'll be talking about that in this conversation. So if you're ready for the goods, because she's ready to pop, this is Going Over the Top. Here's Tim Saywood. Musical Talk. Well, hello again, Tim.
Hello.
Now, you've been to see a show which I've seen described in reviews as an ace in the hole.
Oh, wow.
Which I happen to know...
It's a slightly unfortunate way of describing it.
It's clearly deliberate, because the story we're talking about is Floyd Collins.
Yes, indeed.
The story of a potholer, and we'll talk in a minute a little bit more about that.
Yes.
But I happen to know that quotation was borrowed from a loose adaptation of the real-life story by Billy Wilder in a film, which was called Ace in the Hole. It was about a potholer in a similar circumstance, and the character of Floyd Collins was mentioned in that.
Oh, I see.
So I think that's a clever reviewer doing something clever, but it is a little bit tasteless, bearing in mind what the plot is. So do you want to just let us know first what Floyd Collins is?
I have to put a big spoiler alert on this as we begin, because I'm going to say what the ending is. I think it's useful to know, and also you can look it up. It was a thing that happened in real life, and you can look it up. But if you would rather see the show first, then turn off now.
Bye!
So thank you, one remaining listener, and here's details. It's the story of a guy, as you say, a guy in a hole, which is a very sort of classic sort of
There I was, digging his hole.
Yes. He is in the hills of Kentucky, in the land of the hollows and creeks, as they say at the very beginning, and he's seeking his fortune in a cave, rather after the manner of Aladdin. And the reason why he's doing that is because Kentucky at this particular time, not just Kentucky but elsewhere, has had examples of people who find these very large, echoey, interesting caves that actually become tourist attractions. And that's what he's in search of when at the point he gets stuck. In other words, he's been hunting for a certain amount of time. We don't know how long. He's a young guy.
He's 37 in real life.
Is he really? Well, he certainly isn't portrayed as that in the show. I'd say he's portrayed as sort of young 20s at the most. And in he goes to this cave and sings into the cave and discovers this rather marvellous echo and becomes quite convinced that this is the place where he and his family are going to make their fortune, because they're going to open it to the public and put props in and basically all of this stuff. So just at the point of discovering this cave, in order to get into it, he has to go through a rather narrow opening, and it's just when he's trying to get back up through that same opening that a rock falls and pins him into place. And there he stays for the entire duration of the show, other than some dream sequences. So luckily, his brother is aware that he's in the caves, and after I think a good 24 hours, goes and finds him. And then, without going just describing the entire plot in excruciating detail, there are many attempts to free him, and it transpires that that's not going to be quite so easy as one might think. It's very difficult for anyone to get into the space that he's in to actually try and chip away at the rock.
Because he's in this narrow fissure, and you can't get to the bit that's pinning him down.
I mean, most people can't even get as far as he'd got. Yeah. So because you had to be very skinny to do that, and so there are attempts to rescue him that escalate and that become more and more urgent, and as time passes, and not only do the things escalate, but word spreads that this guy is trapped in a hole, and that it's something of a cause célèbre locally, and it attracts journalists initially, and not only does it attract journalists, it attracts one particular very skinny journalist who then becomes a person who's very key in the effort to rescue him. Then that attracts in turn sponsors.
So I've got to just step in for a second. So this is a skinny journalist who's got the skinny.
Well, indeed, and yes, I think I don't think they do actually do that pun in there because it's far too tasteful. But
yeah, I wasn't.
But you went there, and it's good to know that someone will. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the town becomes something of a circus, but Floyd Collins, despite all of the hullabaloo, is still stuck underground resolutely by this rock. And right up until the very last minute, it's not clear whether he's going to be rescued. Actually, I'm not going to give that spoiler, but it's not very clear what the outcome is going to be.
Well, that is what the whole thing must be about at one level, isn't it? The human drama element of this must be, does he or does he not survive?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the suspense of the thing. But the drama of the thing, obviously, the drama of the thing is motored by that thing and by how his parents feel and the guilt and how his sister feels about the life that they live, and it's a chance to explore the community and the environment that they're in. But it is motored along really by that one single plot point. And as you say, that's where the suspense comes from. However, a great deal of the attraction of the musical is not the suspense, because that's a fairly thin frame to hang the thing on, but really from the score. And the score is an explosion of really rather brilliant rethinking or re-realising of traditional American country forms.
It's been described as a folk musical online.
If you think of something like Assassins, where Sondheim travels into a world of comparatively low musical sophistication, or so it seems anyway,
deceptively, yes.
And picks up on these original country forms and has this very toothsome sort of music. It's very sort of pleasant to enjoy. And this takes that, but exemplifies it. Takes it to a much higher level, because even the yodeling, which is in fact a really key part of that very first number, where he's exploring the echo, is one of the sort of celebrated tricks of the piece. They use an echo, like an echo pedal, so that he sings his first bar, and then the echo comes back of that, but then over the top of that he sings a second bar, and gradually it becomes this sort of weird motet of him and all of his echoes.
On his own?
Just by himself.
And is that actually what's going on?
That's actually what's going on.
They are able to delay it electronically.
That's right. There's a delay. There's what's known as a delay or an echo pedal that often is used for people playing a guitar, and then they play they play the bass, and then the bass carries on forever, and then they carry on. And so it uses that technique, and it's really, really fetching. Vocally, and this production in particular was vocally really a treat, and some amazingly beautifully written music. Composer's Adam Guettel, who doesn't mention in his bio, and I think probably because he's sick of it being referred to, but I'm going to have to mention that he is the grandson of Richard Rodgers, and he's well known for this, and he's well known for The Light of the Piazza. There's also a thing called Myths and Hymns as well. And if you go right back to the very beginnings of Musical Talk, we in fact looked at Myths and Hymns in one of the very early episodes. There was a production in London of that, and indeed we interviewed Mr. Guettel quite some time ago now. God knows what episode that was, number -43 or something like that.
-43.
Absolutely, yes.
But this is one of his earlier works anyway, isn't it? Isn't it 1996, I think?
Yes, it's fairly early on in
20 years on now.
Absolutely, and it has been revived once or twice, I gather, in the UK. I haven't actually seen it on those occasions.
Now, you must tell me where I'm wrong here, but I understood that it only ran for 25 performances on its initial run off Broadway.
Right.
But it was picked up quite quickly as being a show to be seen and got some fantastic reviews because of the virtuosity of the composing and therefore the performances of that soundscape, because it seems to be slightly more than what one might think of as a score. Before we started recording this, you were saying that one of the things that you were most impressed by here was that soundscaping aspect of it, the way people sing. It's not just that the music itself is lovely, it is that it is sung beautifully, it is done imaginatively. Even that echo thing you're talking about is a really good idea.
It's sung in musical theatre voice, but it really, it's what I don't know if it's still known as, but for a while was known as music theatre, to sort of distinguish it from common or garden musical theatre.
A moot point for your lord.
Well, I dare say, but the point of sort of the distinction was that you've got big showy, show-offy, blousy musicals that are sort of unashamedly populist and whatever they do. You've got your opera, which of course is much more serious and much more music focused, but is sung using particular vocal conventions. In other words, it's not the musical theatre voice. And music theatre is this sort of in-between space is like Pacific Overtures or whatever, that uses the musical theatre voice and doesn't sound like opera, but nonetheless has a lot of the features of opera. And in particular this does, because you have these quite extended arias and so on. The plot is not by any means complex or full of machination. It really is a simple, is he going to make it or not?
I'm reminded, just the way you're describing it, of something like the First Lady Suite.
Yes, I suppose so. Yes. Certainly that is also lives in the music theatre world.
Yeah, these are chamber pieces in an odd way, aren't they?
Yes, I suppose so. And I think in some ways that they sort of, dally on the sort of reflective aspect of it. And certainly that's true of The Light and the Piazza, which does use operatic voice and is the other thing that Adam Guettel is enormously famous for. So I think, there's just something very, very beautiful and satisfying about the way that the voices blend and about the way that they sing to each other. And there's something, I think, what's interesting is that we've on occasion talked about Rodgers and Hammerstein and being it's sort of set in kind of the world that some of their musicals are set in, i.e. a little tiny town in Kentucky, and where life seems simpler and people's ambitions are more straightforward and all the rest of it. And in swoops these sort of these big city people,
This is the media circus in this case.
The media circus, and there's an engineering guy who also leads, who's a sort of tycoon and leads on the attempts to free Floyd Collins, which he's sort of basically doing for the publicity for his company. So these sort of moral ambiguities come in, and in many respects, it sort of follows a line that Rodgers and Hammerstein might have done. It doesn't follow that line all the way to the end, it has to be said.
No. But you can see, forgive me, we have on a previous occasion discussed Allegro, you and I, having seen it.
Yes.
And
luckily.
Everything you've said there chimes in absolutely with that particular show, doesn't it? But it is about the native of Kentucky or a country idyll in some sense.
Yes.
And then the baleful or malevolent or unfortunate or corrupting perhaps element of city life, in this case, the city coming to the town rather than the town going to the city.
And indeed, another element is that there are two principal characters. Well, there are obviously several principal characters, but you have Floyd himself, and he is certainly one of the principal ones, because we go into his head and we understand a little bit about what he's thinking. And then there is collectively the town and the community around him, who are this other character, and they're sometimes represented by his brother, who has to come down and just there's a beautiful sequence of riddles that he's just basically trying to keep some days into this now, he's trying to keep Floyd interested in sort of keeping his brain open and staying alive, basically. And he does that through trying to stimulate him through these sort of series of riddles, which sort of recreates a moment in their sort of boyhood, and that's a very sort of exuberant thing. But all of the surrounding characters all have that same sort of role. There's also a certain amount of tension between them as to sort of whose role is to do what and where can people go. But so it does have some of those characteristics of Allegro, but we don't get as you say, the big city comes to us in this case rather than the main character goes to big city, kind of necessity, really, because
the mountain comes to Mohammed.
He's pretty much stuck where he is, and that's kind of the point. So. So I mean, a little bit about the actual real life case of Floyd Collins. You were obviously saying already that we were slightly adrift because he was a different age. So in the show, it depicts these journalists one by one coming in. There's even a whole number about journalists reporting back to wherever the Delaware Bugle or whatever it is. So the Blob? What actually happened with the journalist in the real story of Floyd Collins?
Well, it's exactly as you describe. It's one of the reasons the story is most known, not just because of the human tragedy in real life, but because of the media scrum, if you like. It's described as being one of the three biggest sort of media storms of the early part of the 20th century, after the First World War, and it's the first of those. It's set in the 20s, I think, isn't it, this?
Yeah, I think so.
And it is the first time that there is a kind of sort of national hoo-ha, is the best way of putting it. And they all come to town, and exactly as you've been describing the piece works, because they are flying off their dispatches and getting photographs and conducting interviews with him, I believe, in real life. I think.
Yes, I believe so, yeah.
One of the... I think your skinny reporter fellow that you mentioned earlier,
Skeet.
Actually, who's played by Ryan Sampson, who you and I saw in The Boys of Company G, what was that called? From Here to Eternity, who you and I saw in From Here to Eternity a few years ago.
He's played in
we
that...
didn't. We saw his understudy.
He's played in what by...
He played Skeet in an earlier version of Floyd Collins when he was in London last time.
Yes.
And he's an actor who's fairly short.
Yes.
But taking us back to the scrum, so he was interviewed, and this is where I think it's quite odd. Charles Lindbergh, who's most famous for two things: flying over the Atlantic, I believe, and also then the subsequent kidnap of his son as a result of the media hoo-ha that took place with his first one. Then creates the third of the three big media hoo-has. So Lindbergh is responsible for two of them, but he's also involved in Floyd Collins, because at that stage he was employed as an aerial deliverer of news stories and photographs. So as the photographs were being taken in this place in Kentucky, they were all being flown out to various newspapers across the country, and Lindbergh was involved in that. So there's a strange kind of sort of recursiveness about all this.
Yeah.
So that's the Collins story, and then without going into it, also online you can find out how the subsequent story develops further beyond the end of the musical as well, because it goes on for some years. It goes up to the 1980s.
Oh, right, okay.
There are various family oddments, and where it all ends up is not where it all ends up. Suffice to say that there is a coda which is actually about his final burial place, and that all takes place in the 1980s. But the route to that is quite remarkable, and it's about land changing hands and family wishes being ignored, or it's quite a lot to the story.
Going on display.
Yes, that's right. There was a brief time when his body was put in a glass coffin so you could inspect it.
Wow.
Yes, so suffice to say that if Floyd Collins ran to a third act,
there'd be
it
material.
It could run for another 50 years.
Fair enough. Well, I'm glad it didn't, because it's fairly long already. But it is a very meditative experience, and certainly one to recommend.
A couple of questions about it from my point of view, because I haven't seen it, but I must ask. if you have a central character who is essentially immobile,
Yes.
not that means anything particularly, but that can lead to a fairly static staging, can't it?
Well, luckily they let him out occasionally,
Well,
because
there's a couple of fantasy
we
sequences.
do have flashbacks and fantasy sequences, so he's not stuck there the whole time. I think in some ways it would have been a more daring choice to stick him there, but it's true. It's very difficult to stage if you don't do that. And of course, a lot of the action that we see is on the surface and happens with the journalists and so on. So there's a lot of whirling activity and balloons and funfairs and stuff that.
It really is a proper slightly vulgar scrum, isn't it? This,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it attracts. It's not just the media who are attracted. It is.
We're a
punters
little
and
bit in
watchers
the
and
world
voyeurs.
of Mark Twain and the Royal Nonsuch and that sort of stuff. In
Rubberneckers.
the sort of great tradition of just making entertainment wherever people are, and whatever it's made out of.
Well, it's like going along to. It's not quite the same thing at all, but it is people going along to a public execution because it was a day out.
Yeah,
You bring your sandwiches.
Well, that's right, exactly. Bring the kids. He says that right at the beginning, actually. A family kind of place. It's when he's thinking of the cave. Yeah. So, of course, that's the irony, isn't it? Is that he was hoping to make a tourist attraction, and he sort of did, but
not in the way he might have wanted.
Not quite
Yes,
how he would have wanted. But so it's a fascinating story. It also stops short of, and I think this is a bit of a music theatre feature as well. Unlike your Rodgers and Hammersteins, it stops short of really hammering out a moral from the whole thing, which I think is good. It's just a sort of bunch of stuff that happened.
Don't do potholing.
Exactly.
But another thing that, at least I'm sure I've read somewhere, is that this is quite unusual and refreshing, therefore, as a musical, because there's no love interest, or no overt love interest. It's not boy meets girl.
Well, there are two love interests if you don't mean sexual love. And
hard to do in a cave.
Well, exactly. So all the better reason. He loves his brother and he loves his sister, and they're both quite key characters. The sister sort of fulfills the role that would normally be fulfilled by, Betty Sue outside.
Yeah.
The
love upstairs.
The fiance would normally be. And his brother also, in the sense that the brother gives comfort and is a sort of is a figure. But you're right. Yeah, they don't add in an artificial love interest. And I think it's good because there's a certain amount. There's a bit of a risk of melodrama with this. I mean, it sort of, in a way, was turned into a bit of a melodrama by the media anyway. And one of the things that we see is the process of, subtle things being turned into just sort of a media narrative. An early example of that, whereby they sort of tell the story in a way that romanticizes him, and it doesn't. It's not the real Floyd Collins that's being talked about. And so the family are there to sort of try and explain the very difficult feelings. I mean, at one point his father does have to sort of make a decision as to whether they're going to use this sort of harness method of getting him out. Chances are it would drag off his foot, and not only that, but it doesn't work. So he's got the guilt of that of having done something which was pointless. And having countenanced it, and as a result, there are disagreements and anger within the family, and again, there's a little bit of a danger of it sort of tipping over to melodrama. But it does.
Soap opera almost. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't do. For example, it doesn't give you each a perspective of all of the family members on Floyd, but it's clear that he means something different to each, or represents something. So the sister, talks about. In a way that he represents a freedom for her, that she can go places with him and so on. The brother, he obviously represents sort of memories, and they have a whole thing about going out on the swing tree, and stuff like that, and the riddles, and it's sort of and stimulation of that kind, and obviously for the parents,
of course, yes,
a different sort of represents a hope for the future, and indeed for their old age, which is suddenly thrown into jeopardy. So it sort of goes around that territory, I suppose. And
so it's familial bonds, isn't it? Which is not often explored in musical theatre, though. Not nearly as much.
Perhaps not. I'm probably going to think of some examples later, but...
well, the most obvious one is not in any way a subtle emotional investigation, but Fred Astaire, of course, used to dance with his sister.
Oh, yes,
and
true,
so in all the
Fred
light
Liddell.
comical musicals of the 1920s, for example, Fred would never have a relationship with his dance partner, as he does on the RKO films with Ginger Rogers.
Yes.
There's always the pursuit of love in those, but he couldn't do it in that because it was his sister and it was known to be his sister. So they both go off and find other couples. But that's not really a very subtle
we could
analogy,
talk about
is it?
We could talk about Roadshow and Bounce, Acker Bounce by Sondheim, which is a story of two brothers. I'm sure there's many other examples actually. It's just I can't think of them right this second.
But it's not what road well travelled, is it?
Perhaps not quite so much. No, certainly not as much as the Lovers, the territory of the Lovers. But it makes comparatively little difference, I would say, to the structure of the story. Interestingly, precisely because the sister and the brother both slot into that position that would be held by a lover normally.
And one final question. You said it's a sort of a reworking of traditional folk, but that traditional folk the traditional folk elements of it, I assume, help also plant it in its time, i.e. the 20s.
Yeah.
But I've been reading online that other people have said they can detect Gershwin, Shostakovich,
you betcha.
Other 20s composers, including outside of the world of musical theatre.
Yes, by all means. I mean, just as you have in Sondheim, you have a lot of Ravel in Sweeney Todd, which has got, in theory, nothing to do with the Victorian era in which it's set. I don't know if I spotted the Shostakovich, to be honest, but that's probably more down to my lack of erudition than anything else.
Or it could be an enhanced sense of pretension by the person who spotted it.
Potentially, yes. You sure as heck can spot the Gershwin. There's a whole number, which is the journalist number, called Is That Remarkable? And in fact, I remember talking to Adam Guettel at the time we did the interview. I don't think he went into the interview, but I remember him saying that he'd sort of sweated blood over, many of the sort of sophisticated, beautiful suspensions of voices in the air sort of types of numbers that he did, and there's quite a few of those, including the last one, How Glory Goes, but that he'd sort of dashed that one off comparatively quickly compared to the others, and because it's a little bit of a peppy sort of jazzy sort of a number, not
a pastiche but borrowing from an established genre.
Yes, I suppose so. It's a little bit un-Gershwin in the sense that it's not structured the same way as a Gershwin Tin Pan Alley number, but the sound is of a Tin Pan Alley number. It certainly has a lot of syncopation in it, and it's got a sort of step feel to it as well in the rhythm, like a walking bass line type of thing.
Yeah.
So, and of course that's the one he said people always go on about that number, and I spent X number of, I don't know how long he actually spent on it. I'm sure he
crafted it. I'm sure
he certainly he does craft it. It's a very well written song, but I think it does rankle a little bit that there are these sort of long, noble passages of beautifully written harmonisation and this thing that he sort of threw out, and people go, "Oh, I love that journalist song. It's so nice."
But people like a melody, don't they? At the end
well,
of
it's got a tune that goes bum-be-dum-be-dum. Yes, absolutely. But
leave your name with the girl.
Yes. Yeah, one of these things is very hard to analyse, a show that you really like at some very visceral emotional level, but I think musically it's just so beautiful that everybody should listen to the album, certainly, and everybody should rush and see this is at Wilton's Music Hall. No idea if this is going out at the time that people can see it, but get the album and experience an important step along the way.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. Sometimes these conversations don't go smoothly, but you've helped dig us out of a hole.
There we go. Yes, thank you very much for asking me all those questions.
Hey! Take your pick. Should we stop?
Yeah, stop digging.
Hey! Musical talk. Well, there we are, Tim Saywood there. I don't know which newspaper he was representing, whether it was the Walla Walla Bugle, the Paducah Tribune, the Mexicali Telegram, or possibly the Boise Gazette or the Bumblebee in Birmingham. But in the end, whatever it was, he was kind enough to give us here at Musical Talk the Motherlode Scoop. And as I said before you heard the interview, those are lyrics, as you've probably guessed, from the song Is It Remarkable, which also has the second line, Is It Remarkable Enough? The song sung by the journalists. Now, that was the one that was described as being like a Gershwin number, and indeed one of the reviews I found online called it precisely that. But now, having heard that song, I can't say I agree. In fact, it seems to be slightly out of time. Bearing in mind this show is set in 1925, that is not a representative song of the hot jazz styles of that period. And nor, to my ears, is it 1930s. And of course, Gershwin can't be any later than that period because he died in 1937, 80 years ago this year. Listening to the song, which I must say is a wonderful song, highly enjoyable, and you can see why everyone talks about it as being one of the highlights from the score, to me it sounds really like a 1940s song. There is a dash of the Hot Club of Paris in there, that's Django Reinhardt and Stefan Grappelli, but actually it's more boogie-woogie if it's anything, and it's certainly orchestrated in that way. Various of the performers go at the end of various refrains. So to my ears, it's really a 1940s number. I think people are muddling up the atmosphere of that song with a Gershwin number, rather than it sounding Gershwin-esque. If you know anything about Gershwin and the way he writes, it really doesn't sound like that song, Is It Remarkable? But in our heads, culturally, George Gershwin has been associated with New York, with sophisticated urban dwelling. And of course, in Floyd Collins as a piece, it is the reporters who represent the city, and above all else, New York City. In fact, if you listen to the recording, they're even singing in that kind of mock New York accent. I want the Walla Walla Bugle, the Paducah Tribune. Is that the Boise Gazette? These are all stereotype, and I'm not doing them very well, I'm sure, but these are all stereotype New York accents. And so I think, as I say, it is the cultural connection of Gershwin with New York that people are conflating with the song Is It Remarkable to come away with the idea that it's a Gershwin-esque song. It absolutely isn't. And indeed, I simply can't think of another composer from the 20s or 30s that it sounds like. Most ironically, it absolutely does not sound like Richard Rodgers, given Adam Guettel's relationship with him. However, as you heard from Tim's personal review, he thought the score was wonderful and the show was highly enjoyable, and it certainly won lots of rave reviews on the last two occasions it was in London. For the 2012 production at the Southwark Playhouse, The Telegraph said, "At a time when insensitive media intrusion is under scrutiny as never before, Floyd Collins burns with peculiarly haunting relevance." And for the 2016 production at the Wilton's Playhouse, here are a few choice quotations from various professional reviews which touch on some of the issues which Tim Saywood and I discussed. Paul Taylor, in The Independent, spoke about the score in the following way. "The twang of country music is warped and darkened by operatic atonality. Bluegrass meets Bartok. The ravishing melodic lines go on long chromatic quests as the characters unfold their feelings. Tom Brady's 8-piece band, banjo, harmonica, strings, does knock out justice to both the power and the delicacy of the score." And, of course, Tim mentioned the yodeling song. Here's Paul Taylor again from The Independent on that piece. "The central character tries to judge its, i.e. the cave's, dimensions from the echo of his elaborate yodeling, and soon, and this is a measure of the piece's originality, he's engaged in an amazing 3-part fugue with his own reverberated voice. In the yodeling stakes, you'd have to say that this is one up on Grandfather's Lonely Goat Herd." Grandfather, of course, being Richard Rodgers here. And we also touched in our conversation on the staging. Would having a central character who can't move because he's been pinioned under granite make for a dull, slow-moving, static production? Well, here's Mark Shenton from The Stage. "Butterill's production is staged on a set of interweaving scaffolding poles and platforms, which imaginatively takes us deep inside a cave. It achieves the seemingly paradoxical feat of having a momentum fueled by dread while simultaneously remaining mostly static. It's a high-stakes story, a genuine matter of life and death." And most of the reviews reflected that. Almost everybody gave it very positive results, but they all spotted that it did have one or two weaknesses. Trifling compared to the great overall success, but one or two weaknesses nonetheless. And so I'll conclude with this quick roundup of the reviews with Paul Taylor once again from The Independent, who says categorically, "The show is not perfect. The impulse to offer a sociological critique of the media carnival doesn't seem to come from as deep within the authors as their sensitive apprehension of the existential crisis. The Andrews Sisters style boogie-woogie number for the avid reporters is fine, but a little facile." And that, of course, is the journalist number that we've touched on already on several occasions. Well, I think that probably sums up Floyd Collins. It's a chamber piece that almost everyone who's been to see it has really enjoyed, with an imaginative, clever, haunting, wide-ranging score and a human tragedy at its heart, which also manages to look at the wider issues of media misrepresentation. The Telegraph called it a little-known masterpiece of musical theatre, and I think they're probably right. As Tim says, go off and listen to the score. Or better yet, if you get a chance to see the show, do so. Well, it's probably time to bring this episode now to an end. As you know, here in Britain we have a general election looming. It's very exciting. And so it's time to swap potholing for hot polling. And on that painful pun, I shall now leave you with the traditional words. Goodbye, 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 goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk presented by Thos Ribbits and Tim Saywood and was edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2017. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website, musicaltalkpodcast.weebly.com, or subscribe to us on iTunes, and follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. Please note, the following outtalks do contain spoilers as to the ending of Floyd Collins.
I've seen that. Yeah, I mean, if you think of Assassins, for example, as sort of a place where sort of, Sondheim goes down to what appears to be a level of lack of sophistication musically.
Deceptively so, yes.
Yes, exactly. But really very appealing, very mouthful, very sort of, whatever the word is, very sort of toothsome, yep. I suppose is the word I mean. Type of music. Yes, I don't mean that at all.
Music.
Let's cut that entirely and go back. You know a little bit about the real history of this case, don't you?
I do a little, yes, because I researched it. What do you want?
Well, I mean, what happened?
Well, I don't want to do a spoiler either.
No, okay. Yeah. Well. So basically, there's this business of it becoming a cause célèbre nationally as well.
Oh, do you want me to talk about that?
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Do you want to say that bit again? Because I think I was talking about it at the beginning. It ends up in lots of different places and moves around and changes.
How do you mean?
Well, off the record, when he dies, they leave him there.
Yeah.
So he's buried in the cabin, except he's not. The brother goes back about 3 weeks later and digs him up.
All right.
And then they've subsequently discovered in the 1980s that there was another passage in, which no one saw. So
they
could have got to him.
Oops.
Yeah. And finally, the body was he was interred on the farm of the family.
Right.
Who then moved and sold the farm. And then the subsequent people opened up the grave area and put him in a glass coffin, trying to make money out of him that way, even though the family objected.
Right.
And then someone bought the farm again in the 80s, and the body was finally buried properly, as it were, in the 1980s. That's the last story. But I can't say all that without saying he died.
Well, no, I suppose not. Well, he would have died by now, so you can say the last bit, maybe.
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yes, fine. Such was the media storm subsequent to...
This was like decades later, though.
Actually, no, it was only 2 years later, so I don't think we can use that. Okay. Thinking about it. No, the glass coffin thing. They sold the farm because of the sound memories within 2 years, and almost immediately the new people said, "Come and see the money." So I'll edit that down a little bit. But